to stay out of it. And he does stay out of it. He changed the rules to make sure that the leadership cannot interfere in disciplinary cases. That's important. And so it's really key now that he just concentrates on talking about the issues that Labour wants to talk about in terms of its policies and, its 6 steps, and doesn't, get immersed in very complicated disciplinary and selection process.
What's happening with Diane Abbott? She vowed to continue as an MP by any means last night after she claimed that the Labour Party has blocked her candidacy in her seat, Hackney North and Stoke Newington, which she's represented for 37 years. Keir Starmer, though, says no decision has been made. We tried to unpick some of this with Darren Jones, Labour's Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, earlier. He didn't accept the suggestion made by some that what is happening is a purge of the Labour left.
I don't think that's true. I mean, there are many colleagues of mine in the Parliamentary Labour Party who would define themselves as being on the left, who are endorsed Labour Party candidates standing in their constituency. All this is that because a snap election has been called, there were a number of outstanding issues with some MPs, obviously retiring MPs in some constituencies where we've needed to fill candidates at pace in order to hit the election timetable. And that's the process that's unfolding this week.
Tom Baldwin, do you think what's happening here is exactly as Keir Starmer wanted to happen, going to plan, or is it needlessly messy?
I think some of it's been a bit messy, particularly around Diane Abbott. I don't know what the NEC will decide later, and there is actually a process, and people, can't prejudge what will happen there. I do think overall people can be a bit too squeamish about this. I mean, there is, this is a changed Labour Party, and Keir Starmer has set out to change the Labour Party, and that's a central theme of this campaign. And a bit like people who eat sausages don't always want to see how sausages are made. Mm-hmm. What you're seeing is a process of reinforcing those changes. And when I talk to Labour Party strategists, they point out that the immediate trigger that caused Boris Johnson to be thrown out of office wasn't just the law breaking in Down Street over COVID. It was the behaviour of some of his backbench MPs, like Chris Fincher, Imran Ahmed Khan. And you do have a responsibility to ensure that people are going to be fit for office. And that, this does look a bit messy. People who are a bit squeamish about some aspects of politics won't like this. The end result is a changed Labour Party, a party that looks to the electorate rather than looks internally to its activists.
I take your point. I take your point that some people might not like to see how the sausage is made, but sort of sausage making is not usually this cack-handed, is it? It would be one thing if Keir Starmer came forward and said, because the election's afoot, this is now in my gift. We don't want Diane Abbott as our candidate anymore. Done. But this seems to have been so confusingly done, with something clearly said to Diane Abbott, something different briefed to the papers, something different that Keir Starmer was saying to the cameras. I mean, it's just needlessly confusing, isn't it? Aside from whatever you think about what's actually being done.
Well, I mean, Keir Starmer's right when he says he doesn't get involved in these individual cases. He really doesn't. He's a lawyer. He knows the dangers of doing that. He did set the rules for both selection and discipline in the party, but he doesn't get involved in individual cases. My suspicion is, from what I've heard and read, is that there's quite a protracted process with Diane Abbott about trying to get a deal by which she would stand down, and she has had some health issues, and but to do it with dignity. And that's been a rather long-running thing. And I think there's possibly been breaches of faith on both sides in recent days, with leaks on both sides, and it looks messier than it needs to be. But in the end, is Diane Abbott the most popular politician in Britain? No, she isn't. She's popular with a group of Labour Party activists. Okay. And I don't think the Labour Party is going to suffer greatly from not having Diane Abbott as a candidate, if that is what we end up having.
Hugo Swire?
Well, I think your original question was, is this playing the way that Keir Starmer would like? To which the answer must be no, regardless of the intricacies of the NEC and all that. I think Tom might very well be right. I think there might be other issues here at stake of which we are not necessarily aware. But it doesn't look good. After all, she was a shadow cabinet colleague of Keir Starmer when they were both supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, really quite recently. It does look vindictive. She may not be, as Tom says, the most popular politician in the United Kingdom, she certainly has a following, and that goes beyond the left of the Labour Party. And when you couple that with what's happening to Lloyd Russell Merle, I think he's called, in Kemp Town, and others perceived to be on the left of the party, it does look as if there's a bit of control freakery going on, rightly or wrongly.
But I guess one person's control freakery is another person's, as Tom was suggesting, that, this is what Keir Starmer has always said he would do. It would be a changed Labour Party. And I guess this is proof of the pudding, is it?
Sure. No, I get that. But let's return to your original question. I don't think this is playing well, regardless of what the intricacies of the arguments are for Keir Starmer. I think it looks messy. It's dominating the news from a Labour point of view at the start of the campaign, when I suspect he wishes we were discussing other matters.
Tom, do you worry that we could end up having quite the gaggle of former Labour MPs standing as independents in this election, being quite a thorn in the side of Keir Starmer?
Doubtless that will be a media distraction, and I think Hugo's right to some extent. These rows have distracted Labour from talking about some of the issues it wants to talk about. But stand back from this for a second. I bet Rishi Sunak wishes he had the same control over his party that Keir Starmer has over the Labour Party. I bet Rishi Sunak wishes that he could present a face to the electorate of a moderate, changed Conservative Party, rather than one which seems to be floating off into the extreme marshlands of British politics like the Conservative Party is. So there is someone who has ruthlessly and relentlessly changed his party, and there's a Prime Minister who appears to be sort of too weak to resist his activists at the moment. And I think that is a much more important and lasting image that will dominate this election.
Tom, can I ask you, before we move on, you're obviously a communications expert. You sort of accepted that it's a bit messy and no one really needs to see how the sausage is made. What would your advice be to Keir Starmer to move on from this? Because he needs to, doesn't he, really?
Well, the NEC is going to meet and the NEC is going to take a decision. He needs to stay out of it. And he does stay out of it. He changed the rules to make sure that the leadership cannot interfere in disciplinary cases. That's important. And so it's really key now that he just concentrates on talking about the issues that Labour wants to talk about in terms of its policies and its 6 steps, and doesn't get immersed in very complicated disciplinary and selection processes.
OK, speaking exclusively to The Times this morning, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has made a formal pledge to lower the tax burden if he wins the election. In his first major interview of the campaign, the Prime Minister said, "I'm confident we will get the tax burden down after a difficult few years where I think most fair-minded people appreciate we did the right things for the economy to get them through COVID and help with energy bills. Now our plan is working, we can start cutting taxes." But how realistic is that? Steve Bryan, who's just stepped down as a Tory MP for Winchester, and thinks that voters will be sceptical.
Yes, you can have this race to we won't touch any taxes and actually we'll lower them. But there comes a point where all leaders at this election have to be honest. And if they're saying, well, we'll continue to cut your taxes and we'll continue to raise the spending, then the public are quite entitled to say, but hold on a minute, in the kitchen table economics that I have to exist in and to balance my household budget, something has to give.
Hugo, how do you feel about all of this? We've been talking about it a lot this morning. The sense that all of the major parties now seem to be saying exactly the same thing when it comes to taxes, VAT, national insurance. They won't increase them. Does that ultimately mean that, given there's nothing very much between them, it's not something that people can use to help them decide who to vote for?
Well, I'm a bit sceptical too. I mean, you say they won't increase VAT, but of course, Labour are proposing to extend VAT on education, private education. So they're extending taxes, if not increasing them. But I think we shouldn't get away from the fact that the figures are pretty bleak out there. Government borrowing rose recently to 20.5 billion, I think, which overshot the estimates of 19.3 billion. And that's debt that has to be serviced. Now, that debt's been incurred for a number of reasons. First of all, some of the national insurance cuts we've had already, but also the legacy of COVID, the spike in energy prices, Ukraine, and so forth. So there are legitimate reasons why borrowing has been at an all-time high. But to start talking about tax cuts without saying where the money is coming from all these schemes is, I think, a bit irresponsible.
Tom, on that, I mean, Hugo's right. I mean, the reason why we're not hearing about big tax cuts is because of the state of the economy. But at the same time, the flip side of that is that there are some huge problems that whoever is in government is going to have to tackle. And some of that is going to require cash. Experts are warning that if you don't borrow more or tax more or spend less, then no one will be able to really do very much at all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with the idea that parties are saying the same things on tax, because the Tories are talking about a plan to abolish national insurance, completely uncosted. It's the kind of thing that if Labour was saying, it would be splashes in the Times every day between now and polling day. But, the Tories seem to get away with this stuff. I think there is a bigger issue, which is the inheritance that any incoming Labour government faces is a really bleak one, you're right. And there are £19 billion worth of public spending cuts built into the public finances now, which will cause enormous pain. And I think probably, if Labour does win the next election, I don't know how Labour will implement those. I mean, I was a journalist between 97 and 99 when Labour had to implement £1 billion worth of public spending cuts they'd inherited from Ken Clarke, and that was painful enough. 19 billion is eye-watering, and it's I think it's sort of one of the most underrated facts in this election, that we are facing extraordinary scales of public spending cuts to services which are really being cut to the bone.
I mean, what do you think they're going to do? Because Labour can't escape this. If it forms the next government, that they're not going to be able to get away from it, especially given Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules, which are in some ways tighter than even the Conservative own rules. What do you think the plan will be? There must be one.
Well, there are little pockets of cash they can raise. I mean, Hugo's mentioned putting VAT on private school fees, and that's not some sort of ideological, Marxian program against private schools. It is very simply a pragmatic choice that state schools have suffered year on, year out, cuts in public funding per pupil, and private schools have been putting fees up, and perhaps they can absorb some of the costs, so save those hardworking parents who've been facing rises in fees over the last few years anyway, from further rises. But austerity will have to work for everyone in the long term, and there may be some other tough choices like that, some other pockets of revenue to be raised in different places. I don't know, but I do not see how public services can face another £19 billion of public spending cuts.
Hugo, does this
play?
Yes,
sorry,
of course.
Can I just come in on that? Because I disagree with Tom, I think for the first time in our talk this morning, about this attack on the private sector, private schools. I think it is ideological. I think it's misguided, and I think it's also going to unravel, because it's not going to hit the very rich who can afford to absorb 20% more on their school fees every year. It's going to hit the aspirational classes who make huge sacrifices. And the idea that somehow school places are going to be found for all those people who are going to suddenly have to find them in the state sector is for the birds. It's deeply dishonest. It's ideological. And I'm now confused, because on the one hand, you've got the Labour Party, some of whom still call themselves socialist, attacking the private school sector. And on the other hand, on the NHS, they're talking about using the private sector to attack NHS waiting lists. So I don't understand where the Labour Party is on all this now.
Tom?
This is, I do find it extraordinary. Private schools have been increasing their fees above the rate of inflation for many years now. And
that's not 20%. That's not 20% a year.
They've been increasing their fees above the rate of inflation, while state schools have been suffering decreases in their budgets. Now, state schools have been told by ministers like you, that Tory MPs like you, that they can absorb those cuts. They can cut, one of their extracurricular activities, good programs, maybe make the classes a bit bigger. I'm afraid the best way to deal with this is not to put fees up for parents, but for private schools who have been, raising their fees constantly to build a new debating chamber or another swimming pool. Maybe that private schools now need to absorb the costs like state schools have, and that is not ideological.
Well, I mean, Tom, hang on. I'm going to come in. I'm going to come in between both of you here. I'm going to come in between both of you.
No, it's really important.
All right, time out.
Raise money for 6,500 teachers in state schools. That's a choice. Do you want 6,500 teachers in state schools, or do you want to leave private schools just to keep price gouging their parents?
Hugo.
It's not a choice. It's not a choice. I'm not, by the way, Tom, I'm not a minister, nor am I an MP. But that's by the by. Look, it's not a choice. And the idea that somehow you're going to magic up 6,500 new maths teachers overnight is for the birds. You haven't answered the question about where these extra spaces are coming from, and it is an ideological move.
Tom?
I don't think there's ideology involved in this.
I mean, just off, not on the
idea. Where you find money for state education.
Not on the ideology, not on the ideology, but on the question about what happens to, because there will be many people who will have to take their children out of school. It may not be those incredibly expensive schools. It may be schools where people are really stretching themselves to put their child into a school in their local area that charges a fee. Those people may well be the ones who have to remove their child. What would Labour's answer be to those additional pupils going into a state school system, which by your own admission is already struggling?
I don't see why private school parents have to pay a penny more. I think private schools need to start absorbing the costs like state schools have absorbed cuts year in, year out.
Well, they're not doing that. They're passing it on, as any business would. They're passing it on to their consumer.
And one of
the choice. That's a choice they make as businesses. We'll see. We'll see whether the IFS believes that this will raise money for public finances, and if it was going to cause a mass exodus of thousands of private school parents into the state sector, of course it wouldn't. But the IFS, which is an independent body, believes it will raise a net 1.4 billion.
Yeah, and how many do they say? How many new state sector places are going to be needed? Are they saying?
That's net, including any effect on the state sector.
Well, don't say we don't bring you the intricacies of the economic arguments on all sides here on Times Radio.